Paul of Tarsus, a man of scars, he ascended to the third heaven. Reality shattered. He heard words, areta remata, inexpressible, beyond human speech, a revelation, unimaginable. Then something happened. After paradise, he received a skolops in the flesh, not a thorn, a torture device. The Greek reveals it. The greater the revelation, the deeper the suffering. Not despite it, because of it. Have you felt this paradox? Deepest spiritual moments, darkest crises? You are not alone. You stand with Paul, the other 90%, hidden for millennia, now revealed. Watch.
The air in the third heaven has no smell resembling anything you have ever breathed. It is not incense. It is not rain. Not the cedar smoke from the temple courtyards. It is something completely different. Something that has no word in Aramaic, in Greek, or in any language that human lips have ever shaped. Paul of Tarsus, a man with calloused hands, permanently stained with tent canvas and wax thread, a man who was flogged until his back became a geography of scars. This man lives through an experience so overwhelming that 14 years later, he still cannot decide whether he was in his body or out of it. That uncertainty is not poetry. It is the honest confession of a man whose categories of reality simply collapsed. He heard words. The Greek reveals this with surgical precision. Areta remata, meaning inexpressible utterances. Words that are not permitted to be spoken. They are not forbidden in the legalistic sense. They are literally impossible to translate from that realm into this one. The sound, the light, the weight of that place were pressed into him like a seal into warm wax, and he carried the impression back into the common world, into the smell of fish markets and the noise of looms and the theological arguments of synagogues in cities like Corinth and Antioch. And then something happened. Shortly after the most elevated spiritual experience ever recorded in the New Testament, shortly after the third heaven, shortly after paradise itself, something was given to Paul that he called a skylops in the flesh.
A thorn. That is the word we know from the translation. But if you have only heard it as thorn, you have heard perhaps 10% of what the Greek is actually saying. The other 90% has been sitting there in the text for 2,000 years, and most Sunday sermons walk right past it. Here is the paradox that should hold you completely. The man who was caught up to paradise and heard words that no human being is permitted to repeat, received simultaneously a torture device. The word is not thorn in the sense of a rosebush nuisance. Let us dive into that word with everything we have. But first, sit with the tension for a moment. The greater the revelation, the deeper the suffering. Not in spite of the revelation, because of it. If you have ever felt that your deepest spiritual moments were followed almost immediately by your darkest personal crises, you are in very good company. You are on the same ground as the apostle who wrote half of the New Testament. If this video finds you in a moment where you are carrying something in your body or your mind or your relationships, something that refuses to go away no matter how many times you have prayed over it, stay here. What we are about to discover is not a historical curiosity. It is an architecture of grace that was designed to work precisely in the places where human strength runs out. Now, back to that man in Corinth.
Paul is writing 2 Corinthians around 55 or 56 AD, and he writes it under enormous personal pressure. The church in Corinth, which he had planted with his own hands, which he had watered with his own tears, had been partly turned against him by people he calls, with barely concealed fury, the super apostles. They were traveling teachers who questioned Paul's authority, mocked his physical appearance, and used his own suffering as evidence that God had not truly endorsed him. Their logic was devastatingly simple in that culture. A truly blessed man looks blessed. A true apostle of a powerful God would not appear broken. Paul's response to that accusation is one of the most psychologically complex passages in all of ancient literature. Rather than defending himself with credentials, which he had in abundance, he does the opposite. He boasts in his weaknesses. And the center of that boast, the most intimate and specific thing he reveals, is this: the skolopes teisarche, meaning the thorn in the flesh. Or rather, as we are about to see, something far more violent than any thorn. The Hebrew tradition behind this Greek phrase goes back to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, to a specific term. The Hebrew reveals this through the word tsinor, pipe, which carries the idea of something that pierces, that passes through, that goes deep rather than merely scratching the surface. But the Greek word Paul chooses is even more specific and even more disturbing.
Skolopes, sharpened stake. In classical Greek literature, this word does not primarily mean thorn. It means a sharpened stake, a spike. The kind of pointed wooden stake that armies would drive into the ground around fortifications. The kind of stake on which, in certain forms of ancient execution, a body could be impaled. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, uses this same word when describing military fortifications. The Septuagint uses it in Numbers 33:55, where God warns the Israelites that if they failed to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan, those people would become skolopes, sharpened stakes in their eyes. These are not minor irritants. They are instruments of piercing agony. Paul did not have a thorn. Paul had a stake driven into his flesh. Now, what was it? This is where 2,000 years of commentary have produced an extraordinary variety of answers. And what is remarkable is that Paul never tells us. That silence is not accidental. We will talk about exactly why that silence is part of the theological architecture of this passage. But first, let us present the main proposals that serious scholarship has offered, because each one teaches us something important about the world Paul inhabited. The oldest and most persistent interpretation is that the skolopes was some kind of physical illness. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, suggested headaches or ear pain. John Chrysostom, in the 4th century, leaned in the same general direction: physical suffering that was chronic and debilitating. The most discussed specific candidate in modern scholarship is ophthalmia, a severe inflammatory eye condition that was endemic in the ancient Near East, spread by dust, insects, and contaminated water. The evidence for this comes from Galatians 4:15, where Paul writes that the Galatians would have, if it had been possible, torn out their own eyes and given them to him, and from Galatians 6:11, where Paul draws attention to the large letters with which he is writing in his own hand, which some scholars read as the handwriting of a man with severely compromised vision. There was also the proposal that the skolopes was related to seizures or neurological episodes that some scholars associate with Paul's experience on the Damascus Road when he fell to the ground and had his transformative encounter. That experience, which blinded him temporarily and left him dependent on others, may have left lasting effects. We will talk more about the Damascus Road in the next part of our study. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do that now so you do not miss the continuation.